Calvin sat in his modest home on the outskirts of Los Angeles, his eyes tired from a long day at the auto shop. The warm, familiar scent of incense hung in the air, a subtle reminder of the faith he had built his life around. The walls, decorated with Islamic art, had once been a sanctuary of peace, but now they felt like a cage. It had been 10 years since his wife Najia disappeared. A decade of silence, of pretending the past had never existed. 10 years of living as though he had buried everything. The crime, the guilt, the memories. The authorities had ruled her disappearance as a mystery, an unsolved case that had eventually faded into the background noise of the city. Calvin had rebuilt his life from the ashes of that night. He no longer thought about what had happened, choosing instead to immerse himself in the routine of his new existence. The shop, the mosque, the prayers, all of it was part of his attempt to forget. Every night he prayed for forgiveness, though in his heart he knew he hadn't earned it. He had not confessed, had not faced the consequences of his actions. And yet he felt strangely at peace. The years had softened the edges of his regret, leaving behind only a dull ache that he could ignore. His past, buried deep, no longer threatened to rise to the surface. On this particular evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city, Calvin returned home from work. He had grown accustomed to the quiet of his neighborhood, to the solitude that wrapped around him like a second skin. But tonight, as he approached his door, something felt off. There was a presence, something out of place. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, the tiredness of the day creating phantom feelings. But when he turned the corner to his porch, he saw her. A woman stood there, her figure silhouetted against the dim light of the street lamp. Her features were hidden beneath a scarf, but the way she stood, so still and deliberate, sent a chill down Calvin's spine. Something about her was familiar. She turned toward him as he approached, and for a moment his breath caught in his chest. There was a strange recognition in her eyes, a fleeting flash of something he couldn't place. But when she smiled, the warmth in her expression was unsettling. She introduced herself as Samira, a new neighbor who had just moved in down the street. Her voice was soft, friendly, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made his stomach tighten. He nodded, exchanging pleasantries, but his mind raced. There was something about her, something he couldn't shake. She seemed harmless, but the feeling of unease lingered, gnawing at him. He tried to dismiss it, told himself it was nothing more than a fleeting thought. But as he watched her walk away, something tugged at the back of his mind. He went inside, locking the door behind him, but the strange encounter lingered in the quiet of his living room. As he sat in the dark, his thoughts began to drift. He thought of Najia, of the woman he had once loved, of the night she had left him. The memories had been buried for so long, but now they resurfaced with an intensity he hadn't expected. He tried to push them away, but they clung to him like the shadows outside his window. His mind replayed that night in fragments. The argument, the desperation, the suffocating grip around her throat. He had never truly confessed what he had done, never let the guilt consume him. But now, as he sat in the silence of his home, with the faint smell of incense filling the air, it felt as though the past was reaching out to claim him once more. Calvin stood up, pacing the room, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over him. He thought he had buried everything, the pain, the guilt, the fear. But now, it seemed as though the past was coming back, and he wasn't sure how long he could keep it buried. The knock at the door, the strange woman, the unsettling feeling that had followed her presence. It was as if the universe was reminding him that the past could never truly be forgotten. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And in that moment, as the night pressed on and the shadows deepened, Calvin knew that his quiet life was about to be shattered. Days passed since the encounter with Samira, yet Calvin could not shake the unsettling feeling that had taken root inside him. His routine remained the same: the early morning prayers, the long hours at the auto shop, the occasional visit to the mosque. He had mastered the art of maintaining an outward calm, a life of quiet solitude that kept his past at bay. But something was different now. He no longer felt in control of his own thoughts. The shadow of the past, which he had carefully buried, had begun to creep back into his life. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, the face of Nadia, his wife, the woman he had killed. He had killed her. The words rang in his mind, each time louder than the last. It had been a moment of rage, of desperation. He had not meant to go that far. She had threatened to leave him, to take their daughter and vanish from his life. He couldn't bear the thought of losing everything, his family, his identity. But in the heat of the moment, everything had spiraled out of control. The moment his hands had wrapped around her throat, he knew deep down that there would be no going back. In the days that followed, Calvin tried to convince himself that it was a mistake, that he had no choice. But every passing hour, every passing day, the weight of what he had done pressed harder against his chest. The guilt, which had once been a distant, almost manageable feeling, had become suffocating. He had thought he could outrun it, but now, with the appearance of Samira, it seemed as though his past was clawing its way to the surface, ready to expose him for what he was. He began to notice small changes. His once peaceful home felt colder, more oppressive. The air felt thicker, as though it was holding on to something that didn't belong. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, made his pulse quicken. He had been so careful for so long, keeping his past locked away, but now he felt exposed, as if every secret he had kept was written on the walls, waiting to be uncovered. At work, things weren't much better. Calvin had always kept a low profile at the auto shop, blending into the background. But lately, his co-workers had started to notice the change in him. They would catch him staring off into space, his mind clearly elsewhere. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled slightly when he worked on the cars. He had become easily irritable, snapping at even the slightest mistake. He felt his composure slipping, his grip on his own life loosening. And then there were the dreams. Night after night they haunted him. Dreams of Nadia, of her face twisted in anger, her eyes accusing him, pleading with him for mercy. She never spoke in the dreams, but her presence was overwhelming. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart racing, unable to shake the feeling that she was still there, that she had never truly left him. The dreams were relentless, wearing him down, breaking apart the illusion of control he had so carefully constructed. The cracks in his facade were growing wider, and Calvin knew it. He could feel the pressure building like a dam that was slowly beginning to break. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The past had come back to haunt him, and there was no way to outrun it. His thoughts kept returning to Samira, the woman who had shown up on his doorstep, and the strange familiarity of her presence. He hadn't recognized her at first, but something about her reminded him of Nadia. He tried to dismiss the feeling, to rationalize it, but it gnawed at him. What if she knew? What if she was here to expose him, to tear apart the life he had so carefully rebuilt? The more Calvin tried to avoid it, the more the tension built within him. He began to see Samira's face everywhere, in the streets, at the store, even in the faces of strangers. The world felt like it was closing in on him, and every corner seemed to hold a reminder of the crime he had committed, of the life he had taken. The guilt was no longer something he could push to the back of his mind. It was everywhere. It was suffocating him. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't hide anymore. The past was catching up to him, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep up the facade of the man he pretended to be. Every decision, Every action seemed to lead him closer to the inevitable moment when the truth would come to light. The cracks were becoming chasms, and he was falling through them, unable to stop the descent. Calvin spent his nights awake, his mind racing with thoughts he could no longer control. Every noise in the house felt like an intrusion, every shadow in the corner of his vision a reminder of the life he had tried to bury. The face of Nadia haunted him, but it was not just her face that he saw. It was his own, reflected in the mirror every morning, a face that no longer seemed like his own. The man staring back at him was a stranger, a mask he had created to shield himself from the consequences of his actions. It was a mask that had been forged over the years, a mask that had been painted with smiles and small talk, a mask that had kept the world at bay. But now, that mask was beginning to crack, and with every passing day, Calvin felt the weight of it grow heavier. The days felt like a blur. He went through the motions as he always had. He greeted his co-workers, he served his customers with the same practiced politeness, and he returned home to his quiet apartment where the silence weighed down on him. The mask he wore was impeccable, flawless even. It was the mask of the hard-working man, the devoted father, the loving husband, the man who had done nothing wrong. But the truth was always lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness to expose itself. His daughter, Layla, was a reminder of the life he had taken. She had grown into a young woman in the 10 years since Nadia's death, and every time Calvin looked at her, he saw traces of his late wife, the same dark eyes, the same strong jaw, the same defiant spirit. Layla had never known the full truth of her mother's death. Calvin had made sure of that. He had told her that her mother had left them, that she had abandoned them for reasons he never fully explained. He had lied to her, and he had done it with the same mask he wore for the world. But Layla had always been perceptive, always asking questions he could never answer. It was the one thing Calvin feared more than anything, the possibility that Layla would one day uncover the truth, that the mask he had worked so hard to create would crack in front of her and she would see the man he truly was, the man who had killed her mother. And then there was Samira, the woman who had shown up on his doorstep, the woman who had sparked the fear that had been simmering inside him for so long. She was the one who had seen through the mask, who had recognized the cracks before he even realized they were there. He had tried to convince himself that she was just a reminder of the past, a ghost that would soon fade away. But her presence lingered, and the more Calvin tried to push her out of his thoughts, the more she seemed to infiltrate his life. At night, he would lie awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the feeling that there was no escaping the truth. Samira was still out there, still watching him, still waiting. Every time Calvin thought he had regained control, every time he tried to put on the mask again, she was there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment when the facade would shatter completely. He could feel it closing in on him, a suffocating pressure that seemed to tighten around his chest with every passing hour. The mask he had worn for so long was no longer enough to shield him from the truth. It was beginning to slip. He began to notice small details that unsettled him. The way his reflection in the mirror seemed distorted, as though he was seeing someone else looking back at him. His skin seemed too tight, his features too sharp. The man in the mirror no longer looked familiar, as if he were wearing a mask that didn't quite fit anymore. His hands trembled when he reached for the door handle or when he held a cup of coffee. It was subtle at first, these signs that something was wrong, but they were enough to make him question everything. The mask he had so carefully constructed to protect him, to make him forget what he had done, was becoming less and less convincing with each passing day. At work, Calvin could sense the change in the way people looked at him. His co-workers, who had once seen him as a quiet, reliable man, now regarded him with an air of suspicion. He could feel their eyes following him, their whispers behind his back. They knew something was wrong. They didn't know what it was, but they could sense it. And that was enough to make Calvin's stomach churn with dread. He was losing control of the life he had built, piece by piece. The mask he had worn for so long was slipping, and he had no idea how much longer he could keep up the act. The more Calvin tried to hold on to the mask, the more it seemed to slip through his fingers. It was as though the truth was a force stronger than he was, a force that could not be contained by lies or deception. It was going to break through eventually, and when it did, there would be no more pretending. There would be no more mask to hide behind. The world would see him for who he truly was. A murderer. A man who had taken the life of his wife and lived with the weight of it for 10 years. And when that truth finally came to light, there would be no escape. The morning after the encounter with Samira, Calvin woke up with a feeling of heaviness in his chest, as though the air in his apartment had thickened overnight, suffocating him. The night had been restless, plagued by fragments of dreams, flashes of memories, his wife's face, her pleading eyes, the sound of her voice before everything went dark. He had turned away from the truth for so long that even the smallest hint of it now felt like a storm ripping through his mind. Samira's presence had cracked open a door he had thought securely shut, and now the flood of memories and guilt poured through, overwhelming him. His reflection in the mirror seemed more distant than usual, as if he no longer recognized the man staring back at him. His hands shook as he reached for the faucet, splashing cold water on his face in a futile attempt to wake up from the nightmare. But there was no waking from this. There was no escaping it. He had killed her. He had killed his wife. The thoughts swirled in his mind like a vortex, and the air around him felt thick, heavy with the weight of a decade of lies. He could feel the truth pushing against the walls of his mind, growing louder with every passing moment, demanding to be acknowledged. He had tried to convince himself that his life was a new beginning, that the past was behind him, but Samira had torn that illusion to pieces. She had been right there, a living reminder of what he had done. And now, the guilt was no longer something he could hide from, not even with the mask he wore so carefully for the world. As the day wore on, Calvin found himself moving through his routine, but everything felt wrong. The rhythm of his life, the quiet monotony of work, the brief moments with Layla, they all seemed hollow, as though he were living in a world that no longer made sense. It was as though every conversation, every glance from a stranger, was a reminder of his guilt, of the life he had stolen. His co-workers spoke to him with a kindness that felt foreign, their words bouncing off him like he wasn't really there. Nothing mattered, nothing except the confession that now clawed at his insides, begging to be spoken. By the time evening fell, Calvin knew there was no turning back. He had lived with the weight of the truth for 10 years, and he could no longer bear it. The mask he had carefully crafted had become too heavy to wear, too suffocating to keep up. Samira had shown him that, had made it impossible for him to ignore the reality of what he had done. He was trapped in his own web of lies, and the only way out was to face the truth. He stood in front of the door to his apartment, his hand resting on the doorknob, his heart pounding in his chest. The familiar sounds of the city outside, the hum of passing cars, the distant chatter of people on the street, felt like a blur, as though he were hearing them from a great distance. He had never been one for confrontation, never been the type to admit his mistakes. But this was different. This was no longer about pride, no longer about pretending to be someone he wasn't. This was about facing the consequences, about giving up the last shred of the life he had built on lies. When he finally opened the door, he found himself stepping into the unknown. It wasn't just the physical space of his apartment that felt unfamiliar, but the whole world seemed different now. The weight of his guilt was a constant pressure on his chest, a burden he could no longer carry alone. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and in that moment he realized that he wasn't just confessing to Samira, to the world. He was confessing to himself. Calvin's hands trembled as he made his way to the living room. Layla was sitting on the couch, her back turned to him as she flipped through a book. He paused for a moment, taking in the sight of her, his daughter, the one person he had tried so hard to protect from the truth. She didn't know what he had done. She didn't know what had really happened to her mother. But now, it felt like the time had come for her to know. The mask had to come off, and there was no more pretending. He sat beside her, the silence between them stretching out like a vast chasm. The words felt like they were lodged in his throat, impossible to say, yet inevitable. Layla didn't look at him, didn't sense the storm that was raging inside him. She was lost in her book, unaware of the tidal wave of guilt that was about to crash over them both. The confession came, not with the force he had expected, but in a whisper, a quiet admission that seemed to echo louder in his mind than in the room. He told her everything. He told her how he had killed her mother, how he had strangled her in a fit of rage, how he had buried her body in the woods, how he had lied to her for all these years. There was no more hiding, no more masks, just the cold, brutal truth. As he spoke, the weight that had been pressing down on him for so long seemed to lift, if only for a moment. It wasn't relief, not really, but it was something. Something that felt like a step toward redemption, or perhaps just an end. Layla sat still, her eyes wide with shock, her body rigid with disbelief. She had never known the truth, and now that it was before her, she didn't know how to process it. The world around her seemed to tilt, to shift out of focus, and for the first time in years, Calvin saw his daughter as she truly was. Broken, lost, and unsure of everything. But in that moment, there was nothing left to say. The confession had been made. The past had been dragged into the light, and all Calvin could do now was wait for the consequences to come. The days after Calvin's confession passed slowly, each one feeling like a countdown to something inevitable. The weight of the truth hung over him like a dark cloud, suffocating every part of his existence. He had expected relief, or at least a sense of freedom, but there was none. Instead, the emptiness inside him grew with each passing hour. The once familiar world outside his apartment felt foreign, distant, as though the vibrant city of Los Angeles had become a cold, indifferent place. The noise of the world, the sounds of life continuing as usual, only served to amplify the isolation he felt. Samira had kept her distance since the confession, her presence still a looming shadow in his life. She had made her point, driven him to the edge, forced him to face the consequences of his actions. But now that the truth was out, the need for revenge had faded, leaving only the broken remnants of her own soul. Her obsession with justice had consumed her, and now, like Calvin, she was left with the fragments of a past that could never be mended. Calvin found himself wandering the streets more often, unable to stay still, unable to rest. His mind was a constant whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Guilt, fear, and regret battled inside him, but beneath it all, there was something else, a feeling he couldn't quite name, a pull, a force that guided him towards something, some resolution. But what was it? What was left for him now? It had been weeks since he last saw Layla. She had been distant since the confession, retreating into herself, unable to process the weight of the truth. Calvin knew he couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't take back the years of lies, but he had to try. He had to find a way to make amends, even if it meant sacrificing the last of his own peace. As the evening drew near, Calvin found himself standing at the door to Samira's apartment. The air was thick with tension, as though the very atmosphere itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He had come here with a purpose, with a decision that had been building inside him for days. The path ahead of him was uncertain, but there was no turning back now. He knew what he had to do. Samira opened the door slowly when she heard the knock, her face a mask of weariness. Her eyes were hollow, the fire that had driven her so long now reduced to embers. She looked at Calvin, and for a moment, there was no anger, no hatred, only an understanding between them, as if they both knew the truth about the path they had walked. There was nothing left to say. They had both played their parts in a tragedy that had been years in the making. But now, in the silence between them, Calvin felt something shifting, something breaking free. He stepped inside, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. They stood facing each other, the weight of everything between them. The years of pain, loss, and betrayal, the vengeance that had driven them to this point. And now, in the stillness, there was only the reality of what remained. Two people, each broken in their own way, each searching for something that could never be fully healed. For the first time in a long while, Calvin felt the clarity he had been seeking. The answer had always been within him, but it had taken the unraveling of everything he had known to see it. There was no redemption, no absolution for the things he had done. But there was the possibility of peace, a peace that could only come through letting go. He looked at Samira, her face expressionless, but there was something in her eyes, something that spoke of a woman who had lost herself in the pursuit of vengeance. She had achieved what she set out to do, but in the process, she had sacrificed her own soul. Calvin knew that he had done the same, in his own way. The lives they had taken, the years they had spent chasing shadows, had left them both with nothing. There was a moment of silence, a pause that stretched out between them before Calvin made his decision. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small locket he had kept hidden all these years. It was the last piece of Anna he had, the last connection to the woman he had loved and lost. He held it out to Samira, the gold gleaming in the dim light of the room. She didn't reach for it immediately, but after a moment, her hand moved, slowly, as if unsure whether to take it. As she closed her fingers around the locket, a quiet understanding passed between them. There was no more need for revenge, no more need for punishment. The years of pain, the years of hatred, had brought them to this point, and now they could finally let go. Calvin had no illusions that this would solve everything, but it was the only way forward, for him, for Samira, and for Layla. There was no more justice to be found in the world they had created. The only thing left was the quiet, painful process of rebuilding, of learning how to live with the ghosts of the past. Calvin turned to leave, but as he reached the door, he paused. He knew that his journey was far from over. He would have to find Layla, to face the consequences of his actions, to find a way to rebuild the broken pieces of their lives. But for now, as he stepped out into the night, the weight that had burdened him for so long felt just a little lighter. He had made his choice. He had chosen to let go. And in that choice, there was a flicker of hope, small but undeniable.